Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane Harmon. I'm the chairman, no, I'm not. I'm the president and CEO of the Wilson Center. I'm also a recovering politician, having spent 9 terms in the United States Congress, where I became good friends with our keynote speaker today, Congressman Wolf, who will be sharing his report with us on a trip to Egypt and Lebanon, on his trip to Egypt and Lebanon in February. We at the Wilson Center watch developments in the Middle East very closely from every angle. Our Middle East program focuses on issues concerning religious minorities, among others. And just last month, Wilson held a meeting on where is the cultural revolution in Egypt headed, featuring one of our senior scholars, Margaret Badran, which examined the cultural and religious transformations that have taken place in Egypt over the past two and a half years. In fact, I've been to Egypt 4 times in the past 18 months and have been very disappointed at trends, and I'm sure they'll be discussed today. As I mentioned, Wolf and I were colleagues in the United States Congress for almost 2 decades. We are in different parties. I think it's fair to say we are friends and worked closely together, regardless of party. We worked on issues like homegrown terrorism right up until I came here. Frank was the author of the International Religious Freedom Act, which passed in 1998 with broad bipartisan support, surely including mine. So when he speaks on these issues, we ought to listen. He was also, by the way, the author of the 9/11 Commission Act, and was just telling me that that's going to be, is it reinstated or?
Yeah, the bill brings back.
It's coming back. And some of you will remember that a guy named Lee Hamilton was co-chair of that report. This report, which we'll hear about today, deals with one of the region's greatest challenges right now, ensuring that new democracies meet the need for pluralism and protection of minority rights. Religious freedom in the Middle East is declining. I think that's an understatement. And religious minorities are feeling increasingly marginalized. I think that's also an understatement. I went to the Middle East 25 times as a member of Congress, and as I mentioned, have returned 4 times to Egypt and several other times to the region. And what I see across the region gives me a lot of concern. And on Egypt specifically, I wrote an op-ed last week entitled "Egypt is Too Big to Fail." That doesn't mean it might not fail, but 90 million Arabs, the largest Arab population in any country, should deserve more than they're presently getting. Religious minority groups can't just be ignored. Lebanon's population is almost 40% Christian. Egypt's 8 million Coptic Christians represent about 10% of the population. Syria's population is 16% Christian, not to mention that Sunni and Shia Muslims themselves are minorities in certain countries. Shias comprise 10 to 11% of the population in Saudi Arabia. Groups like the Baha'is, which number around 300,000 in Iran, comprise the largest non-Muslim minority in Iran. I have a dream, I'm sure all of you share it, that someday, somehow, the Middle East will figure its problems out and become an economic powerhouse where everybody has an opportunity to participate in the success story. But that only works if there's religious reconciliation in the neighborhood. So I'm delighted to be here. I think next up is is the Honorable Wolf from Virginia. Please welcome a former colleague and a wonderful friend and member of Congress.
Thank you, Jane. In the interest of, I was not the author of the 9/11. It's of the 9/11 Bring Back the Commission, although I was one of a handful of Republicans that voted for it. If you recall, the large number of Republicans did not like the 9/11 Commission. I did, and think we bring Lee Hamilton and Governor Kane back to look to see what was done or what not was done. But I want to begin by thanking my former colleague, Jane Harmon, Congresswoman Harmon, and the Wilson Center for hosting this discussion on what a timely issue is, the future of religious minorities in the Middle East. I've long been focused on international religious freedom, specifically on the plight of persecuted people of faith, whatever they may be. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, and I quote, "In the end, we remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. America has always been a friend to the oppressed, the persecuted, the forgotten. But sadly today, that allegiance is in question as religious freedom and human rights abuses around the globe increasingly go unaddressed and unanswered. Looking to the Middle East, there is often societal and communal violence and repression against religious communities, which specifically target religious minorities. Too often, the governments of these lands foster an atmosphere of intolerance, or in some cases, such as Iran, outright criminality as it relates to different faith traditions like the Baha'is. Tragically, since 1979, the Iranian government has killed more than 200 Baha'i leaders and dismissed over 10,000 from government and university jobs. Further, throughout the region, there is an impunity surrounding acts of religiously targeted violence, onerous registration requirements for houses of worship, and a general climate of fear, which isolates and too often drives out religious minorities. These realities have been exacerbated by the so-called Arab Spring, a spring which has devolved into winter for many of the most vulnerable in these societies, foremost among them the ancient Christian communities. The future of religious minorities in the Middle East is, of course, the focus of the discussion today. I would argue that if the current trajectory holds true, the future of these communities, communities which are woven into the very fabric of the region, is uncertain at best. In February, I traveled to the Middle East, specifically to Lebanon and Egypt. One of the main purposes of the trip was to spend some time with a Syrian Christian community, a community with ancient roots dating back to the 1st century. We read in the Bible about Paul on the road to Damascus. According to the latest estimates, the brutal civil war, which continues to rage, has taken nearly 93,000 lives. With the Syrian crisis entering its 3rd year, the eventual outcome, including how many will perish in or be displaced by the continued violence, and who will step into the power vacuum, is far from certain. Moreover, what will this mean for the Christian community in Syria is largely unknown and unfortunately rarely addressed by Western media. I wanted to hear firsthand from Syrian Christians about their concern and to put this issue in the larger context of an imperiled Christian community in the broader Middle East, specifically in Egypt and Iraq. Coptic Christians and other minorities in Egypt have increasingly been marginalized with the ascendancy of the Muslim Brotherhood. The recently drafted constitution, which made blasphemy a criminal offense, is highly problematic. A February 5 Associated Press article reported, quote, provisions in the document allow for a far stricter implementation of Islamic Sharia law than in the past, raising opponents' fear that it could bring restrictions on many civil liberties and the rights of women and Christians. Increasingly, these fears are being borne out. Just last month, a young Christian teacher in Egypt was accused of insulting Islam while teaching a social studies course. In a Christian Science Monitor article about this case and the trend more broadly, a local human rights activist reportedly said, quote, all Coptic teachers are scared here now that any child who fights with them could accuse them of blasphemy and drag them into court. The issues I've just outlined must be viewed not simply as today's news, but rather through the lens of history. A phrase not often heard outside the majority Muslim world is first the Saudi people, then the Sunni people. The Saudi people are, of course, the Jews. Except for Israel, their once vibrant communities and countries throughout the region are now decimated. In 1948, there were roughly 150,000 Jews in Iraq. Today, we have heard roughly 4 remain. In Egypt, there were once as many as 80,000 Jews. Now, roughly 20 more or less remain. We met with a leader just last week of the Jewish community, and she said it's 20 more or less, and probably more less than more. It appears a similar fate may await the ancient Christian community in these same lands. Consider this observation by author and adjunct fellow at the Center for Religious Freedom, Leila Gilbert, who recently wrote in the Huffington Post, quote, between 1948 and 1970, between 80,000 and 100,000 Jews were expelled from Egypt, their properties and funds confiscated, their passports seized and destroyed. They left stateless with little more than the shirts on their back to show for centuries of Egyptian citizenship. One of my last meetings in Egypt several months ago was with 86-year-old Carmen Weinstein, the president of the Jewish community of Cairo. She was born and raised in Egypt, had lived there her entire life, a life set against the backdrop of a great Jewish immigration out of Egypt, namely the departure of thousands of Egyptian Jews from 1940s into the 60s. She led a small community of mostly elderly Jewish women in Cairo who, with their sister community in Alexandria, represent Egypt's remaining Jews. There are 12 synagogues left in Cairo. Some, along with landmark synagogue in Alexandria, have been refurbished by the government of Egypt and with help of the U.S. Agency for International Development, and have received protection as cultural and religious landmarks, but many have not. Further, the 900-year-old Byzantine Jewish cemetery is half overrun with squatters and sewage. Ms. Weinstein sought to preserve these historic landmarks as well as the patrimony records of the Egyptian Jewish community. Not long after my return to the U.S., Ms. Weinstein passed away and is now buried in the very cemetery she sought to protect. Meanwhile, with the fall of Hosni Mubarak, Coptic Christians numbering roughly 8 to 10 million are leaving in droves in the face of increased repression, persecution, and violence. A January 8 National Public Radio story reported, quote, Coptic Christians will celebrate Christmas on Monday, and many will do so outside of their native Egypt. Since the revolution there, their future in the country has looked uncertain, and many are resettling in the United States and other countries. A May 15 New York Times piece with a headline, quote, Christians uneasy in Morsi's Egypt, reported that since the ouster of Mr. Mubarak in February 2011, a growing number of Copts, including some of the most successful businessmen, have left Egypt or are preparing to do so, fearing persecution by an Islamist-controlled government as much as the stagnant economy that is smothering their industries. And yet, our government continues to give increasingly scarce U.S. foreign assistance to the Egyptian government without a single string attached. Just last month, weeks before an Egyptian court sentenced more than 40 pro-democracy NGO workers, several of whom are American, including Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood's son, to jail, Secretary Kerry quietly waived the law that would have prevented the $1.3 billion in U.S. taxpayer money from going to Egypt, absent concrete steps toward true democracy and respect for human rights and religious freedom. Similarly, Iraq's Christian population has fallen from as many as 1.4 million in 2003 to roughly 500,000 today. Churches have been targeted, believers kidnapped for ransom, and families threatened with violence if they stay. In October 2010, Islamist extremists laid siege on Our Lady of Salvation Catholic Church in Baghdad, killing over 50 hostages and wounding dozens more. The head of the Chaldean Catholic Church in Iraq reportedly told Mideast Christian News that the number of Christian churches declined precipitously in the last decade. There are roughly 60 Christian churches left in the entire country, down from more than 300 as recently as 2003. Of course, much smaller but no less vulnerable, religious minorities have also suffered greatly in Iraq. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom in its recently released annual report found that, quote, large percentages of the country's smallest religious minorities, which include Chaldo-Assyrian and other Christians, Sabian Mandeans, and Yazidis, have fled the country in recent years, threatening these communities' continued existence in Iraq, end of quote. And yet, last year, the General Accounting Office released a report titled U.S. Assistance to Iraq's Minority Groups in Response to Congressional Directive, end of quote, which it has conducted at the request of several members of Congress, including Congresswoman Anna Eshoo and myself, after hearing from representatives of the Iraqi diaspora community that despite targeted congressional funding intended to assist those religious communities, little tangible proof or impact was being seen on the ground. Over multiple years, Congress directed the State Department and USAID to dedicate certain funds to help Iraq's minority population, also supported by Senator Levin and others in the Senate. But GAO found that these agencies couldn't prove they spent the funds as Congress intended. Perhaps this failure to follow a clear congressional directive was attributable in part to a refusal on the part of this administration and, frankly, the Bush administration to acknowledge that minorities were being targeted rather than merely victims of generalized violence in Iraq. In short, over the span of a few decades, the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, has virtually been emptied of Jews. In my conversation with Syrian Christian refugees, Lebanese Christians, and Coptic Christians in Egypt, a resounding theme emerged. A similar fate, they said, may await the Sunni people. While it remains to be seen whether the historic exodus of Christians from the region will prove to be as dramatic as what has already happened to the Jewish community, it is without question devastating as it threatens to erase Christianity from its very roots. Consider Iraq. With the exception of Israel, the Bible contains more references to the cities, regions, and nations of ancient Iraq than any other country. The patriarch Abraham came from a city in Iraq called Ur, now near what they call modern-day Nasiriyah. Isaac's bride, Rebekah, came from northwest Iraq. Jacob spent 20 years in Iraq, and his sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, were born in northwest Iraq. A remarkable spiritual revival is told in the book of Jonah occurred in Nineveh in the Mosul area. The event of the book of Esther took place in Iraq, as did accounts of Daniel in the lion's den. Furthermore, many of Iraqi Christians still speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus. In fact, in February 2013, Smithsonian Magazine's story noted, quote, "As Jesus died on the cross, he cried in Aramaic, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?'" End of quote. Further, in Egypt, some 2,000 years ago, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus sought refuge in this land from the murderous aims of King Herod. Egypt's Coptic Christian community traces its origin to the Apostle Mark. It also, it appears, is happening in the Middle East, is effectively emptying of the Christian faith. This will have a geopolitical implications and does not bode well for the prospects of pluralism and democracy in the region. These developments demand our attention as policymakers. But rather than just being met with urgency, vision, or creativity, our government's response, both executive and congressional and both political parties, have been, I think, anemic, and at times outright baffling, especially to the communities most impacted by the changing Middle East landscape. We would do well to recall the words of Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. He said, quote, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." Prior to February, I was in Egypt in June of 2011, 4 months after Mubarak stepped down as president and turned over power to the military. In the face of decades of human rights and religious freedom abuses under the Mubarak regime, successive U.S. administrations, including the Obama administration, failed to advocate for those whose voices were being silenced. Many pro-democracy activists and religious minorities that I spoke with during the trip felt abandoned. They felt abandoned by the West. Their disillusionment with the U.S. and general trepidation about the rise of Islamists in the lead up to the elections was tempered by a palpable sense of anticipation and, in some cases, hope about what the future might hold for the Egyptian people. But that hope has long since faded, and fear has taken residence. In conversations after conversation, Coptic Christian reformers, secularists, women of all backgrounds and denominations, and others told me that the U.S. was perceived as the largest supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood-led government. Further, there was a widely held perception that the U.S. was either disengaged or simply uninterested in advocating for religious freedom and other basic human rights. This is a perception informed by reality. Briefly turning from the Middle East for a moment, consider the following. Genocide persists in Darfur. The Sudan Special Envoy position has been vacant for 3 months. An internationally indicted war criminal, Sudanese President Bashir, travels the globe with impunity. Meanwhile, the administration actively worked to undermine congressional attempts to isolate Bashir by cutting off non-humanitarian aid to countries who host him, and then in April rewarded the notorious Sudanese government official accused of torturing enemies and seeking to block UN peacekeepers in Darfur with an invitation to Washington for high-level meetings. In China, human rights issues are consistently pushed to the back burner, as seen in a recent summit. This administration and the previous administration have ignored bipartisan calls to place Vietnam on the State Department's list of the most egregious religious freedom violators, despite crackdown on people of faith and an overall deteriorating human rights situation, preferring instead a policy defined simply by trade. Consecutive administrations have been silent about the brutal gulags enslaving thousands in North Korea and can barely muster an objection when the Chinese government flouts its international obligations to North Korean refugees by deporting them to an almost certain death sentence. These examples are too numerous to cite. In 1998, I authored the International Religious Freedom Act, IRFA, which created a dedicated office at the State Department, headed by an ambassador at large who was intended to serve as the primary advisor to the Secretary of State on religious freedom. It also created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent bipartisan advisory body distinct from the State Department, which can make clear-eyed policy recommendations unfettered by other diplomatic or bureaucratic considerations. The legislation created the countries of particular concern, designation reserved for those countries with the most severe, systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations. A designation which has been grossly underutilized by this administration has even failed to even designate any CPC since 2011. At the time of introduction, as is their institutional inclination, the State Department was adamantly opposed to the legislation and sought to undermine it at every turn. Just last week, the National Security Subcommittee of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee held a hearing which examined the government's record of implementing IRFA, at which panelist Chris Seipel testified. There was near unanimity that over the course of successive administrations, both Republican and Democrat, IRFA has not been implemented as Congress intended. The IRFA office is presently buried in the bureaucracy. The ambassador, a fine person, is marginalized. The issue itself, America's first freedom, is viewed as periphery. Fast forward to 2011, I worked with Congresswoman Anna Eshoo to introduce bipartisan legislation to create a high-level special envoy charged with advocating on behalf of religious minorities in the Middle East and South Central Asia. At the time of the introduction, the IRF ambassador post had been vacant for 2 years, sending a clear message globally that this issue simply was not a priority. The legislation overwhelmingly passed the House last Congress, only to stall in the Senate. And then Senators Webb and Curry blocked it from moving forward, largely at the request of the State Department. Congresswoman Eshoo and myself, along with Senators Blunt and Carl Levin, have reintroduced the legislation this year. The legislation mandates that the envoy would have a priority focus on Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, countries where Christians, Baha'is, Ahmadi Muslims, and Jews and more face incredible repression, persecution, and violence, and even, many times, death. There is a historic precedent for effective special envoys advancing seemingly intractable issues. Consider former Sudan Special Envoy, former Senator John Danforth. His laser beam focus on the peace process, high-level access to the White House, and undivided attention to his mission was incredibly effective. I don't pretend to think that a special envoy will single-handedly solve the problem, but it certainly can hurt to have a high-level person within the State Department bureaucracy who is exclusively focused on the protection and preservation of these ancient communities. This will send an important message to both our own foreign policy establishment and to the Congress and to suffering communities in the Middle East and elsewhere that religious freedom is a priority, that America will be a voice for the voiceless. Let me conclude by sharing the quote of a Coptic priest who recently interviewed about the blasphemy charges facing a young Coptic teacher I mentioned earlier. He said, quote, "Today, despite this repression, we can live. But tomorrow, what will we do? The coming days will be much worse." End of quote. This much is clear. Absent strong, principled, bipartisan U.S. leadership on this fundamental human rights, the future for religious minorities in the Middle East will indeed be much worse. In a Constitution Day speech, President Ronald Reagan described the United States Constitution as a covenant we have made not only with ourselves, but with all of mankind. We have an obligation to keep that covenant, for it is a covenant that transcends time and place. It was not just for the people in Philadelphia in 1787 during that hot summer. It is for people all around the world today. It is a covenant with the beleaguered Coptic Christian in Egypt, the imprisoned Baha'i in Iran, the fearful Chaldean nun in Iraq. We would do well to remember that repressive governments the world over fear the words of the Constitution and the promise they hold as much as they fear the aspiration of their own people. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Let me continue explaining how this panel will proceed. We have invited 3 top experts on this issue to comment on the congressman's presentation and also add their views. So we will start with Marshall Breger, to my left, who is a professor of law at Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America and vice chairman at the Jewish Policy Center, which is a Jewish conservative think tank. You have a longer bios of all our panelists with you, so I will stop here and invite Marshall to please proceed.
Thank you very much. Is this on? I think it's on. I want to thank Congressman Wolf for a powerful and thought-provoking presentation. My assignment was to try to broaden the conversation. The situation of Christianity in the Middle East is an evolving tragedy. They were the original church, the living stones of Christianity, so to speak. And they were for centuries part and parcel of the region, having worked out a complex and ever tenuous modus vivendi with Islam. But in the last 50 years, the Christian communities of the Middle East have faced physical and communal danger. Many Christians have fled. Others see themselves as martyrs for the church. We have to remember that in Islamic law, the dhimmi, the adherents of Judaism and Christianity, had a legal place in the world of Islam, perhaps a second-class place, but a legal place. He or she had to pay a special tax and had certain other disabilities, which expanded or diminished in different Muslim societies and eras. But legally, the Christians and Jews had a place in the Muslim firmament. You could not imagine throwing the Jews out, as happened in countries in Western Europe. In the last 200 years, Christianity and Judaism have been seen as an imposition of the West. And thus, these religious minorities have become a political issue and not just a religious issue. And radical Islamic scholars have begun to speak of a Muslim world without Christians and without Jews. This is the root problem for Christianity and Judaism and Islam. We also have to remember in this context that there's a special problem of the evangelicals' need to evangelize. This runs up against the view in both normative Islam and Judaism that religion is like a membership in a tribe. You can't opt out. This is a theological problem for Islam and one that it has to address. The issue is compounded by the fact that many of the converts made by evangelicals are not Muslims, but are from the traditional Christian churches of the East. Thus, the traditional churches, Catholics, Orthodox, Armenians, are pitted against the evangelicals. I know for a fact that at least 2 countries of the region, government action against evangelicals was instigated by the mainstream churches. Now, Congressman Wolf, is this supposed to be the
It's supposed to be the
Congressman Wolf's emphasis on
evangelical.
the religious minorities in Syria and Egypt is particularly interesting and underscores the need to analyze each country on its own terms. Now, the tragedy of the Christians in Syria is a function of politics as well as theology. We have to look at Lebanon. When the French took over Lebanon and Syria after World War I, their original plan was for a Christian majority in Mount Lebanon, a mini Lebanon, a small Lebanon. The French imperialist lobby and the Catholic Church said no, large Lebanon, Bekaa Valley. The result, a Lebanon that did not maintain a Christian majority, and the Christians were thrust into a political fight, not a religious fight, but a political fight with the Muslims. Similar issues existed in Syria. And in Syria, the additional problem that the Christians threw their lot in with another minority, the Alawites, and this has caught them up in the human tragedy we see unfolding. Egypt, a different situation entirely. The Copts are a historic, endemic, even original part of Egypt. And it's true, as my contacts in Egypt tell me, that lawlessness is rife in the country for everyone. And the police have basically stood down in politically charged situations. But this should not get Mr. Morsi off the hook. If the police cannot or will not protect the cops, he can call in the army to do so. And the U.S. should encourage him to take the necessary steps. Now, I'm going to go back to the broader context. To the extent to which this is a political problem, we have to seek ways for Islam to accommodate with the modern world, even as we insist on fundamental human rights. And the State Department has to take into account the persecution of Christians in its policy development. Take Syria. There's no point in seeking general assurances from the Syrian Free Army that they will leave Christians alone if they should win. The U.S. has to proactively work to develop links, even if covert, better if covert, between Christians and anti-regime forces. It must press the Syrian National Council to speak out that Christians will be protected and that those who attack them will be named and brought to justice. And thought may even have to be given to a Christian autonomous zone in countries like Syria and possibly even Iraq as a second best solution. The State Department also, Syria is too far along for this, but needs to promote efforts at interfaith associations and groups. Recently, the Iraqi Interfaith Association was formed by civil society in Iraq. We should be promoting that. I can't, in the presence of Congressman Wolf, fail to note the Council for Religious Institutions in the Holy Land, which he asked Secretary Rice to support, and which myself and Bob Destro had a small role in assisting. You can argue that its impact has been modest, but it's also been miraculous. I can tell you that the chief rabbi had only met once with the Latin patriarch to shake hands, never to talk. And the notion that the chief rabbi would meet with the Palestinian head of the Islamic courts was almost impossible to imagine. Yet, they've been meeting every month or two, and they've been getting on like a house on fire. So relationships are vital, and the U.S. can assist that in ways that Congressman Wolf understands. Now, to the extent to which the problem is theological, the remedy must be within Islam itself. And that's why the efforts of Imam Mohammed Majid of the Adams Mosque in Virginia to bring Muslim scholars from the entire Ummah, from the entire Muslim world, together to create a code of conduct, protocols for the protection of religious minorities in Muslim majority countries is so important. This group has been, quote, blessed by the religious and the secular leadership in Morocco, in Tunisia, by Al-Aqsa in Egypt, by many other world Muslim religious leaders. They've met in Tunisia, they met in Mauritania, they're meeting in Senegal. They hope in the next year to have a final meeting in Morocco where they will develop a protocol, a code of conduct, not by, quote, progressive Muslim scholars, but by scholars in the mainstream who are highly esteemed. This is, just to give one example, Sheikh Abdul Ben Baya of Mauritania, one of the leading and respected Muslim scholars, said in his position paper for a conference in Tunisia that there needs to be a new definition of citizenship, one which is no longer based on shared histories, ethnicity, and religion, but rather on a voluntary association between individuals in a particular land. What is needed now, he argued, is a non-discriminatory body of laws that mediates justly between competing claims in an ethnically, religiously, and racially diverse public square. And he draws this from Sharia. So we have to work, encourage Muslims of this stature and this inclination to move forward. I'm running out of time. I also want to briefly note the 2011 OIC resolution on defamation of religion and its follow-up with the Istanbul process and the Rabat Plan of Action. Before 2011, the Organization of Islamic Conference wanted to penalize defamation of religion. In 2011, they made a volte-face, and they argued for basically education, socialization, alternative means to encourage religious toleration. Now, some people don't believe them. And certainly there's been slippage. And certainly we see states in the Islamic Conference have gone in the wrong direction, like Egypt. But still, there is a text which is basically a charter for religious toleration, and we need to build on that text and work with them to promote that text in their own countries. In closing, I should say that we need to call on the State Department to do more. I don't know if a special envoy for Christians is needed. I defer to experts on that. But I do know that a special emphasis by the U.S. government is needed. When I worked for President Reagan, I had the honor of sitting in on some meetings that Secretary Schultz had with Russian high-level figures. He would start the meeting talking about Soviet Jews. He could have said, we got to break for lunch. I got to mention something to you. He could have waited till they were ready to close and say, oh yes, there's one other thing. But he would start the meeting to let them know how important this was to President Reagan and to the American people. Similarly, I understand that on his trips to China, he visited with Christians and with dissidents. Again, to underscore, I can assure you the Chinese government didn't like that, but he wanted to underscore the importance of this issue and the importance of it to a proper relationship with the Chinese. We need to see this kind of emphasis from this administration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marshall. I turn now to Chris. Chris Seipel is president of the Institute for Global Engagement, a research, education, and diplomatic institution that builds sustainable religious freedom worldwide through local partnership. And the rest you can read on the bios we have circulated. Special welcome to you. It's your first time at the Wilson Center. We hope to see you more in the future. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, ma'am, and welcome to everyone. And thank you to Jane Harmon and Frank Wolf for their service to our country on these issues, because if we do pursue our values, I think we will take care of our our interest. And I'm also grateful to my Jewish brother in humanity, Marshall, for mentioning living stones, which is a quote from our Holy Scriptures. I happen to be a Christian, from 1 Peter 2, and that means a lot to me, Marshall, so thank you for doing that. I happen to be a Baptist, and I'm happy to report that Baptists and Anglicans are getting along out where I live in Fauquier County, about an hour west of here. I'm actually a constituent of Frank's. And I mention that because I think it's been proven to be apocryphal, but it should be true if it wasn't. But the 1785 Remonstrance on Religious Freedom by James Madison was reportedly instigated by the idea that Anglicans were torturing Baptists. And that was Protestant on Protestant, let alone Protestant on Catholic. Don't mean to call you out. Which begs some humility as we think about these things in our own historical context, and as we think about our own evolution from Roger Williams, also a Baptist, and then all the way through Thomas Jefferson, and then the 1998 Religious Freedom Act. It takes some time to think about these things within the conversation, intra-faith, and to be theologically orthodox, lowercase o, and then how you apply those principles to governance and such issues. I am the president of the Institute for Global Engagement. We're a think and do tank. We try to think before we do. We have the world's only journal on faith and international affairs, therefore it's the best. It's published by Routledge, and we work on issues of religious freedom through local partnerships in East Asia, in Vietnam and Laos. I would respectfully disagree with my congressman on the need for CPC for Vietnam, but that's a separate conversation. And we also work in the Muslim majority world, in Pakistan and Syria before these tragic events, and have spent quite a bit of time engaging Salafis, which I will come back to, all of which informs my experiences and presentation today. I want to make some big picture comments quickly, what I think the crux of the issue is, and then some practical recommendations moving forward as a former jarhead or Marine infantry officer, because you have to get from A to B at the end of the day, and you can only do so much talk. One is we're experiencing this biggest change in the Middle East since 1918. I think we should be aware of that. Yes, the trend lines are very worrisome. Yes, we should call attention to them and express them. But it could be a whole lot worse. Witness Syria. It could be a whole lot better. But I take some comfort in the fact that Al-Noor has responded to the Brotherhood and Al-Watan has responded to Al-Noor. This is the natural process of people trying to gain and have power and influence, and they compete against each other. So we need to take a big picture perspective, at the same time not standing for any thing to the detriment of minorities, ethnic or religious. Second big picture point is the U.S. does not have a vision for the region. It's not our region, to be sure, but we ought to have a vision about how we engage it. I lived in Poland in 1988 and 1989. And I happened to be in Prague the night of the Velvet Revolution started, 17 November, and then went up to the wall. What I didn't realize at the time was that my president at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush, had provided 5 speeches between April 17th, and May 31st on a vision to move beyond containment. The point is, he was repeatedly laying out ideas and practical solutions about how we move forward in America, in Europe, a Europe whole and free. And that was before the wall came down. And then there was another 2 years before the Soviet Union, and then everything else. The point is that you can have vision amidst great uncertainty before the biggest change takes place. That's called leadership. We don't have any in this country on this issue or in other countries around the world. Third big point, the real religious freedom issue in the Middle East, to my mind, is how Muslims treat Muslims. Shia versus Sunni has to be figured out. And until that is, I don't think we are ever going to get to a answer that we can appreciate and respect on minorities. And so what is the theological position of the Shia and the Sunni about the other, beginning within their own faith tradition? Just like Anglican and Baptist and Protestant and Catholic. It has nothing to do with the religion. It has everything to do with the nature of man. I say that as a Christian, and I welcome your rebukes. But we're fallen, and we will choose to be deceitful, as it says in Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful beyond all measure. That's why you have to balance things out. And as Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't have to worry about any of these things. Men are not angels, nor women. So how do we think about it? I also understand that engaging my friends overseas, especially Islamists and Salafis, they will say to us, I've heard this many times, well, we have to worry about the majority first. It's the majority that has been oppressed. I respect that opinion. I cannot relate to the oppression that you've experienced, especially for the Salafis who were in jail throughout the authoritarian regimes that we happen to support. But at the same time, how you treat the other is the ultimate indication of the strength of your faith, and therefore the civility of your society, and therefore the stability of your state. It begins with how you treat the other. The crux of the issue, I think, is this. There's no sustained space to have these kinds of conversations on a regular basis. I will give you a couple examples that I'm familiar with, but boy, do we need them more than ever. For the last 5 years, I have been working with a group called the Neon Process. To overindulge in the stereotype, we have gathered European secularists, American Christians, and Middle Eastern Muslims to talk about how we talk and learn about how we engage each other. There is a modicum of trust to enable sufficient consensus to do some things together. That's the only dialogue I know of that has met that way for that long. Hopefully there's others, and I hope to be corrected. But those are the kinds of things that we need, where government officials, top down, are working with grassroots religious leaders, bottom up, and people at the local level to figure out how we address these issues, the Neon Process. Secondly, I would also say, I've engaged the Salafis, as I've referenced earlier. That came out of a discussion at the Neon group where I said, what if we Christians, and I happen to be of the evangelical strain, lowercase e, and what if we sat down with Salafis and talked about what our holy scriptures say about engaging the other? And since then, we've had 2 conversations with Salafis. And I must confess that I have stereotyped the majority of them. But they're not a monolith. There are nonviolent Salafis. Maybe through nonviolent Salafis, there's a way to work on some of these issues, but nobody in our country is talking to them. We ought to find a way to do that. The other thing is to say this, back to the humility of the American experience. We are a country founded on religious freedom, but we have a great difficulty in talking about religion and politics, because we've all been taught not to talk about religion and politics in polite company, assuming you keep polite company. I've got Bob here. I'm going to keep picking on Bob because he's to my left. He's polite and he's nice. But here's the point. In terms of our government being institutionalized to deal with this, we haven't broken that code. To her credit, Secretary Clinton organized a strategic dialogue with civil society, of which there was a religion and foreign policy working group that invited 100 civil society, religious scholars, experts, et cetera, to come in and speak into how the U.S. State Department forms and informs its policy. That's unprecedented in diplomatic history, the top-down asking the bottom-up in. Full disclosure, I'm a senior advisor to that process. Bottom up, several of us religious freedom NGOs meet every 2 months on Capitol Hill. We meet by ourselves for an hour and a half, sharing ideas, and then we invite Capitol Hill staffers and members and all those kinds of folks, National Security Council, State Department, to meet with us. That's the bottom up inviting the top down in. And that's the kind of world we live in. It's a track 1.5 world, whether you like it or not. That's conflict resolution speak. Track 1 is government to government. Track 2 is people to people. If you're at the intersection of that, that's how you're going to have influence and have impact over the long term. One is unsustainable without the other. So how do we do it? How do we make it happen? And that's why I'm so grateful for this panel, that you have government and non-government together. In conclusion, 5 quick recommendations about how we get this better, or try to get it better. We need a vision for the region. We need some speeches about what we think we could be doing, how we can help folks. I know it's terribly complicated, especially in Syria, but that's what leadership does. It's a complicated world. Get used to it, and let's figure out how we can help people, because there's 93,000 dead in Syria, and there's 1.6 million refugees, and they're Christian, and they're Muslim, and they're suffering together. Take the chaos, in other words, and turn it into an opportunity for a new vision for the broader Middle East. Include the Iranians. Think about making our aid conditional. Think about the relationship with the Israel-Palestine peace process. We've got to think big and be bold. But another peace process that's piecemeal does nothing. Second thing, we need to strengthen how we engage religion. The white paper that emerged from the Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group at the State Department, that made recommendations about how the U.S. government should do religious engagement. Religious engagement, but meaning engaging religious communities on issues of development and defense and diplomacy, which if there was a focal point for that, then maybe the Office of Religious Freedom could focus just on religious freedom, because it is not staffed properly. And as Congressman Wolf said, we have a wonderful ambassador with a tremendous personal testimony. But she doesn't have the staff, and the structure under which she reports, as the GAO recently reported, is completely unsatisfactory and completely and totally inconsistent with the law and what was envisioned back in 1998. That is wrong. Third, we need to encourage and institutionalize different kinds of dialogues that link religion and security and citizenship. I just came back from a religion, security, and citizenship conference we did in Kazakhstan. Citizenship is a broad narrative that provides an on-ramp for all parties, political and religious. What does it mean to be an equal citizen under the rule of law, as opposed to an ethnic or a religious minority? It's a different conversation. And oh, by the way, we have to train our government, not just State Department, but Department of Defense and others, on how to engage on these kinds of issues, because they're scared to talk about it, according to how they were raised, and according to the Establishment Clause, which they see as a red line, which I think could be nothing further than the founders' purpose. How could we be ignoring religion at the threat of as a threat to the Constitution, when actually the Constitution was presented to engage religion and make it a voice that speaks into public policy from the perspective of principled pluralism, which means there can be exclusive claims to truth. And you're not a bigot because you say that. And that we can respect differences about how we worship the eternal. Lastly, two last points. I think we have to encourage multi-faith exchanges. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine's the vice president of Liberty University, largest evangelical school in, I think, the world at this point, but certainly in Virginia, my home state. He was just in the Syrian refugee camps in Jordan, and he spoke with a Muslim man. This is on a op-ed on FoxNews.com or whatever. And he asked him, what is the message that the West needs to hear? And it was the same thing that Congressman Wolf reported in his meeting with the Christian doctor in Lebanon. We are people too. What if university students, multi-faith, sons and daughters of Abraham, came out of our universities to do projects working with Syrian widows in the refugee camps? Track 2, people to people, it would be a different thing. And then finally, track 1, top down, what if we had interparliamentary exchanges and institutionalized those kinds of things? They've been done before, different groups have done different things, but an intentional, comprehensive approach to the region that brought together people like Jane Harman and Frank Wolf together with their counterparts over there and shared lessons about how this stuff gets done, because it ain't pretty, democracy. It's the worst system, except for all the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last panelist is Robert Destro, a professor of law and the director and founder of the interdisciplinary program in law and religion at the Columbus School of Law at Catholic University. Bob Destro has been an old friend, and I have to say that he and Marshall did a lot to help through their interfaith dialogue when I was in prison in Iran, to try and get me out through their clerical connection. Bob, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking you, Hale, and Mike Van Dusen for setting this up, and to Mr. Wolf and to Jane Harman for providing the framework in which we can have a very interesting discussion today. I'm going to try and keep my remarks pretty short because I see myself in the kind of the cleanup position as the one who has to recommend that there needs to be, people have to have homework assignments before they leave. And so the idea is that if we're going to have a nice discussion, I don't want this discussion to be, geez, there's a lot of problems here with people in the Middle East. My formal comments started to say, it'd be tempting to say that a lot has been said and written about religious freedom in the Middle East. But the more accurate rendition of the current state of the religious liberty, about the literature about religious liberty, is much has been said and written by religious freedom advocates about religious liberty in the Middle East. But very little of what we read gives us much hope that policymakers, either in the United States or in Europe, are listening. Okay. Worse, I fear, is that those whose job it is to make and execute policy don't understand the religious or cultural dimensions of the unfolding geostrategic nightmare we're witnessing over there as it unfolds before our very eyes. Nor does the American news media seem to understand or report on the stories. No reporting, no analysis, no understanding. To their credit, and I want to point particularly to an op-ed that Mr. Wolf and Mr. Van Hollen wrote in the Christian Science Monitor. And they said, and I quote, "Syria's Christians and the prospect of a tolerant endgame in Syria are now in direct peril as a result of the civil war," unquote. They report on the April 22nd abduction of the Greek Orthodox Archbishop of Aleppo, Reverend Boulos Yazigi, and the Syriac Archbishop of Aleppo, Yohanna Ibrahim, and the murder of the Syrian Orthodox deacon, Fatah al-Kabud, as they sought to provide humanitarian relief to those suffering and displaced by the civil war. Now, if you were to go down the street and ask a number of Americans who these people are, you just get a blank stare. There has not been much reporting on this question, even among the American religious press. Okay, so one of the questions I want to leave you with is, what do we need to do now to influence what Representatives Wolf and Van Hollen have called, quote, the prospect of a tolerant endgame? That is the discussion. What does a tolerant endgame look like? What are its components? What are its civil society components? What are its legal components? What does a good outcome in the region look like, not only from a geostrategic point of view, but also from a human rights point of view? That question is almost never discussed. Our policymakers speak volumes about the negative outcomes we in the United States seek to avoid. We want to avoid the survival of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. We want to avoid the resurgence and hegemony of al-Qaeda in Iraq. We want to avoid the transformation of the civil war into a sectarian war between the Shia and the Sunnis, with the region's Christians being murdered and forced into exile. We want to avoid all that. But what we don't hear is that the United States has a government has a good sense of what it will take, or to put it more bluntly, with whom we must engage on the ground in the region to achieve what that tolerant endgame in Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Iran, and other areas of the region. We just don't have a sense for that. So my fear is that we're fighting another war in which we don't know the cultural rules, the religious landscape, or enough of the people on the ground who are critical to the formation of the civil societies we want to see flourishing there. As you've heard from both Marshall and from Mr. Wolf and Chris Seipel, you've heard that there are engagements going on. Chris is involved with some of the Salafists. Marshall and I have been involved in both Iran and Iraq with the clerical leadership there, and there are many opportunities in Iran and Iraq to do some good work to bring some sense to what's going on from a policy perspective in the region. But as I read the newspapers, I sit and listen to us being focused on Russia, on what Vladimir Putin is doing in Syria. That's very interesting to me. But we can't let ourselves be bound by Cold War rhetoric and being worried about the preservation of post-World War I great power relationships in the region. We most of these discussions have little to do with the reality of life as it's experienced by those who live in the region and hope to make a future for themselves in the Middle East. So, like I say, we have to have a good sense of what a good outcome looks like. Now, a serious program involves what, as Chris Seipel has quite rightly put it, track 1, government to government, track 2, people to people, and track 1.5, engagement with those who are working in the region. You know, as one who has worked for years in religious liberty here in the United States, I can tell you that it's not always been a picnic getting American religious groups to work together on common problems. But it has happened. It's happened over the years, by and large, because of the perception that there's an outside threat. You have that going on now in the fights with the United States government over things like the affordable care mandates. But suffice it to say, you have everybody's attention. Okay, well, we also have people's attention about the plight of religious minorities in the Middle East. Okay, but as I've said many times among the people with whom I work, you know, our great challenge is to engage the American religious communities, the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities, in a joint effort to reach out to their contacts on the ground. Because one of the things I've learned in my experience working in religious liberty in the United States is that everybody knows somebody that they can pick up the phone and call. And that sounds like it sounds like a trite thing to say, but the fact of the matter is that until we started working on connecting some of the religious freedom groups here in the United States with their counterparts in Iraqi Kurdistan, there was a great interest in the American groups, but nobody knew anybody. And so what we have here is, how do we bring the energy and dynamism of the American religious community into this effort? That has got to be a very strong priority, not only of the religious groups to work together, but also, you know, to take advantage of what's going on now on the ground. Who are the best people in the United States to report back to their home communities? It's groups like ANIRA, groups like the relief groups, Catholic Relief Services, World Vision. All of these groups have people on the ground. They should be reporting back in a systematic way to a group of people who are coming together, as I hope this group will eventually, to push forward a policy of the United States government that will support religious freedom and minorities in the region. How do we, as advocates for religious freedom, engage our own government in an effort to use these religious communities? That, I can tell you, is like pulling teeth. You know, at the State Department, there is we know that there's an Office of Faith-Based Community and Neighborhood Initiatives. If you were to ask them, how do you work to push forward these issues of religious freedom in the Middle East, the answer is they don't. Okay, what they do is they say, our job is to help these religious communities get involved, but it stops there, because there's not a good sense for the religious dynamism of the region. Religion, unfortunately, I think in the State Department is viewed as the problem, not as part of the solution. So what we need is a series of faith-based and community initiatives in the field of foreign policy. And that's, I also have to congratulate Mr. Wolf for his very successful efforts in putting together the Council for Religious Institutions in the Holy Land. It's been modest, to be sure, but it's path-breaking. You know, and if we could replicate that model in Iraq, in Jordan, and other places, it would be very, very helpful. We also need to engage the dynamism and concerns of the Christian communities, in particular of Russia. I mean, one of Patriarch Kirill of Moscow has been all over Vladimir Putin to protect the Christians in Syria. Okay, you know, we don't look back, we don't learn from our history about who the Christians in Iraq supported. They knew what was going to happen after the civil war in Iraq. And now the question is, how do we engage those Muslim communities in Iraq, in a collaborative effort to create a good civil society, that tolerant endgame that we all want to see, and what they want to see. They live there. As one of the priests in Baghdad told me when I was in Kurdistan a couple of years ago, I said, how is it? And his answer was, we don't want to die, but we'll be there with our community if we need to be. And the question is, how do we reach out and help him? So to be actively involved, the resources available at the human level in this country are enormous. And I'm not talking about money. I'm now talking about the human engagement level that needs to be put together. We cannot do what needs to be done without the active support of our government. But it's going to take a more accommodationist view of religion than they have. I don't mean money, although that would be helpful, but tacit support. Not just the International Religious Freedom Office. I need to get licenses to bring certain people over to this country. It would take me months. If I want to we've been trying for years to do a conference on Shiism here in the United States. We'd like to bring in some Iranians to talk about it. I mean, that will take me the next couple of years to get done. So if we really want these engagements, we need to have those little adjustments being made at the side. We need to engage the media. I would suggest strongly that if Woodrow Wilson has some extra time on its hands, to have a meeting of major media who cover the region, to ask them why they're not covering these stories. Okay, because if they don't, the religious press as well as the secular press, and then engaging religion. The Iranians have suggested to us that we engage in a joint project to train Sharia law judges in Afghanistan. Where are people going to meet when they get called up on these kinds of charges? They're going to meet Sharia law judges. If we've trained them, I'm going to be a lot more confident that they'll get a good outcome. In Turit, South Sudan, Christians helped build the mosque many years ago. The Muslims are now want to help rebuild the cathedral. They can get no support from our government or from anybody else in that effort. So and then lastly and most importantly, that we need to get the American religious community, the American government, to get the American religious communities to engage the Russian and Greek Orthodox churches. Those are the people who have the most people on the ground in the region, and those are the people that we need to engage. So so what we need is more engagement, and we have plenty of ideas. So now we're ready to hear yours. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Bob. Before I open the floor, I would like to see whether the panelists would like to comment on what each other, on what your statements were. And I would like to put a question to you. Don't you think the problem is also the constitutions that we see in the Middle East? I mean, the new constitution of Egypt basically does not protect the right of minorities. It's very vague in it. In Iran, where you have a constitution that recognizes the right of the people of the book, meaning the Jews, the Christian, and the Zoroastrian, nevertheless, I mean, they are not treated as equal citizens. And, in Tunisia, where it's a very secular thing, after the Arab Spring, the Jewish community has been threatened regularly. And finally, in Iraq, where the United States was involved in drafting the Constitution, we saw the exodus of the Christian community. So where is the problem in the region? I mean,
Are you going to
Congressman
Well, Justice Scalia once pointed out to me that if you read the former Soviet Constitution, it has every right in the world. Right to health, right to a job, right to life, right to free speech, right to everything. Well, that's great. It's not worth the paper it's written on, because the civil society and the social culture was not based on pluralism. So I'm all for specificity in constitutions, but I'm more for a vigorous civil society and a vigorous culture that promotes pluralism. You yourself mentioned that the Iranian Constitution has protections for the people of the book. Well, they're not getting it. And no one's, and it doesn't much matter that you can wave the Constitution around. So sometimes, and I speak as a lawyer against law, so I'm speaking against interest, but sometimes we can obsess too much on the legal arrangements without paying the necessary attention to the social arrangements and the development of a pluralistic civil society that will, in the end, protect human rights.
Very briefly, I agree with just about everything that was said, and I want to, thank the panelists. I think from my perspective, what it takes, though, is for the United States to adopt basically the Scoop Jackson, Ronald Reagan idea of advocating for. Someone mentioned Secretary Schultz. When Schultz would go to the American embassy during the 80s, he would meet with the dissidents, or if they were in jail, he would meet with their families. He would literally go climb 4 or 5 floors of stairs and meet with them the same way that the Jackson people, and so it needs to be a desire, it needs to be a fervor that our government cares deeply, deeply about these things. Lastly, it can be done in a very appropriate way. If you recall, President Reagan told the Soviet Union to tear down the wall. We know that, and yet if you recall, when he went to the Danilov Monastery and stood with Gorbachev, he spoke out for human rights and religious freedom, and he even stumbled slightly, and Gorbachev grabs him, if you recall. And lastly, if you recall, at the Reagan funeral, nobody was better for advocating for human rights and religious freedom. At the Reagan funeral, who came? Gorbachev came to the funeral. So you can do this in an appropriate way, but it all comes back to the desire of our government to make this a priority. The similar it was during the days of Jackson Vanik, the 70s, and the Reagan administration during the 80s. It takes that type of intention by our government. Failure to do that means it will not be successful. Just look at the issue on Darfur. We had a group to come together to say that no aid, non-humanitarian aid, not humanitarian aid, but no aid should go to any country that welcomed Bashir, who's an indicted war criminal. We couldn't even get that. The administration opposed that. There's been 200 to 500 people, 1,000 died in the genocide in Darfur. It was Muslim on Muslim. Everyone knows that he's an indicted war criminal. You would have thought that would have been very easy, but the administration didn't even want to go there. So it takes what I would call the Scoop Jackson, Ronald Reagan approach to deal with it. And if you have that type of approach, we can do tremendous things.
Constitution.
Well, if you want to comment, I'll I think I completely agree with the Congressman. In some ways, the Constitution has to be the capstone, because if it's not socially owned, it doesn't matter whether it's legally protected, as Marshall said. And the process of making it socially owned requires an intentional strategic engagement of high-level officials that says that our country cares about this thing, these issues and these values, and that our interests are honored when we honor our values, and we're going to make it at the forefront all the time. And it doesn't mean you have to beat people over the head or name, blame, and shame or embarrass. There's ways to do this at strategic moments, but it requires a vision. It requires a strategy, and we don't have one. And the other piece of this, though, too, somewhere in between, is that, I can't remember whether I mentioned it or not, but law enforcement. Law enforcement is the key. People have to be trained to a certain standard about what it means when you are of a different faith than the person that you are prosecuting or going after or whatever, and you have to be even more fair in those contexts. And that's where we need, I think, a lot of work. If we could have minority faiths from people who are of minority faiths in the Middle East, but perhaps majority here, go to the Middle East and talk about how they do law enforcement as people of faith here, that would be a very interesting conversation. There's a lot of red tape, I'm sure, in that, but that would be helpful.
Thank you.
No, the only thing I have to say is that people here in the United States tend to focus a lot on the Constitution, but our constitutional protections for religious liberty, as we teach them in law school, really started. I mean, we've had them for a long time, but they were not taken all that seriously by our own Supreme Court until the 1930s. So much of the case law that we know of today, which unfortunately affects our foreign policy in some very unfortunate ways, that lead them to believe that the only thing you can look out for and talk to, as someone at the Pentagon said to us, it's unconstitutional for us to speak with ayatollahs. Well, if you need one to get a nuclear weapons treaty, then maybe you better get over it. So we need to really think very carefully, and I think start at the bottom, as we did here in the United States, with the police exchanges, with judges, with jurists, with ayatollahs, with the seminarians. There's all kinds of places that we could be working together, and we need our government to help us do that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open the floor now, and please identify yourself, but I'm going to take a question from the overflow, and any of the panelists can address that. The question is, what about recommendations for engaging with non-believers and other non-religious and non-Abrahamic minorities, for they also face much persecution? Who wants to take this question?
I agree.
Congressman, please.
Well,
Yeah.
I agree. I think we met with a number of bloggers, young bloggers in Egypt, who are of no denomination. They were Muslims, they were Sunni, but they were not. I mean, I think anyone who is having their human rights and freedom impact. So I think you engage with everyone. I don't think you limit it to just any particular faith group.
Okay. Chris, a question for you. How do you think this multi-faith dialogue with Salafis would help non-Muslim minorities?
Well, we've only met twice, so it's hard to make any practical statement. All I know is that if you don't engage, then there's every opportunity for the worst to happen. If you do engage, maybe there's less opportunity, according to your own stereotypes. And if you start to get to know people, the stereotypes are reduced, and the confessions begin about how much you have stereotyped the other. And that has been my experience with the Salafis. There's a lot that I still need to learn, and them about us, but I do know that there are nonviolent Salafis who don't like being painted in a monolithic fashion. And that, I think, is true of any group. And that's what we have to work against, while being very clear-eyed about where the worst of extremism and violence comes from, which tends to be from a Salafi, Wahhabi, Puritan, Arab, Sunni form. And we have to name that for what it is, too. And engage, and there's good people within those strains. But you have to name things accurately, otherwise you get into a war on terror, which is an oxymoron, because you cannot fight a tactic. But you can fight against people who are forsworn against you and seek to kill you, and that has to be addressed with named properly.
If I could just go, I think Chris is right. During the 80s, we would meet with people in the Soviet Union that you would never want to meet with. But we met with them because you just met with them. And there is something magic about breaking bread with someone, having a cup of coffee and just eating. I mean, there's something magic. So Chris Smith and I and many others, I'm sure Jane was in it, would meet with people in the 80s that when you would go home, you would tell your wife, I met with this guy, I can't believe it. But there was something good about it. And Reagan, too, met with people that he did not disagree. And the whole theory of the Helsinki Committee, was to meet with people during the 80s and 70s that you did not agree with. And so meet with anyone. And I like Chris's idea about having a congressional or parliamentarian group, because the Helsinki group meets a couple of times a year. They have one big meeting every year. But I think you should meet with anyone, and then, because we ought not be afraid of our views. We believe that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. Ronald Reagan also said the words in the Declaration of Independence were a covenant with the entire world. So we have those views, but I agree with, meet with them. Meet with them and argue with them and aggressively and break bread with them, but let them know what we stand for. But always take, as Marshall said, always take the opportunity to advocate for people. And lastly, delegations, both executive and legislative, should bring names of prisoners of conscience, because during the Refuseniks Day in the Soviet Union, we always brought names in with us, and at the beginning of the meeting, we brought the names up and raised the names of X and Y and Z and those who were in prison, and then we went on. But I agree with meet with them.
Can I add
Yes,
one
of
other
course.
thought? Maybe I'll be accused of violating church and state rules. But at least for those people who are believers, it's also can make a big difference if you pray with them. I was in Iran, Bob and I were in Iran with Cardinal McCarrick some years ago, and of course he's a political genius. He was dressed in all of his cardinal finery, and the Ayatollahs were dressed in theirs, and he was our titular leader. He would start the meeting by saying, "This is such an important meeting, will you make a prayer for us?" The entire atmosphere changed. Here was a prince of the church asking a Shia religious leader to make a prayer. Complete shift. And indeed, we met one time with the then Minister of Justice, who I'm told was a go-to guy for the supreme leader, which meant he had a lot of blood on his hands. He afterwards was so pleased, he said, "When will you make a prayer, Cardinal?" So McCarrick turned to the rabbi who was with us, said, "Rabbi, will you make the prayer?" Again, a very powerful message. I've never understood why George Bush, who was someone who prayed a lot of times on his own and liked to pray, wanted to pray, found solace in prayer, didn't ask the supreme leader, "Let's pray for peace." Let me tell you, you can't be the great Satan if someone asks you to pray with them. It changes the whole relationship.
Farah, no, please.
I have a comment to do with first, Mr. Breaker, which you were talking about laws. I was a parliamentarian in Pakistan until recently, and we have been fighting the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, which are the strictest and the most objectionable blasphemy laws in the world. And Egypt has now, for the first time, got within their constitution, they have formulated and put on the books a blasphemy law. Now, because I worked in human rights and on the Human Rights Committee in the Pakistani Parliament also, and I traveled the whole country and I dealt with people who were suffering, very poor Christians and other minorities who had the blasphemy law around their necks, and there's no way out of it, right? Laws are all important in any country. What's happening today in Muslim-majority countries, Arab or non-Arab, is basically an attempt towards a purification. And if that is something very important, whether it's majority Sunni Muslim, Pakistan, Shia Muslim, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis, Salafis with the Shias. So let's not, and I'm a Muslim. So I feel very uncomfortable when I sit here and I hear Americans say, you are the people that we look up to for belief in laws and the Constitution. Because when I used to get a human rights lawyer to go and help someone, a poor Christian woman who could speak nothing but her local dialect, when those laws exist, you have no protection. You have to fight to keep the laws off the books. Then you have to have civil society and community and all of that. But the laws are a signal to the mosque immediately. We have had, so I really do feel that laws are extremely important in protecting minorities.
Well, I certainly won't disagree with that. All I would say is that the laws are not sufficient. And if you, at the end of the day, you have to have pluralism residing in the culture, not just in the law. And in the Muslim countries, I don't purport to be an expert on Islam, but we have to see if those Muslim scholars who would support diversity and support pluralism have to be empowered and will, take their message. And now I suppose that is in contrast to what you are saying, probably in a way quite correctly, is a shift toward purification in different countries. The question is whether this purification is sociological or is intrinsic to Islamic theology. And here I don't know the answer. I don't know enough to know the answer, to make a view on the answer.
Bob?
Yeah, I have one comment. I wanted to pick up on the idea of purification. And that to me is it's always good to have the laws on the books. But if I had the choice between the law on the books and training the judge, I would take training the judge. Because you have to come, especially in a setting, a sociological setting, where there is a push toward the purification of Islam. You have to come, as the Christians had to come, from within the tradition to show them that this is not consistent with God's will. And then unless you can speak in that religious argot, you're not going to be heard. If this is an imposition from the outside, it's got to come from within, and that's, as Marshall has put it, our experience with the Iranians, as we've said, what does Islam teach you about human rights? That is a discussion you can have, and it will go on for days. And so that's where the engagement has to be on both levels.
Yes, the gentleman here.
Thank you, Helen.
Brief questions, because we have a lot from the...
Absolutely. My name is Faraz Maqsad. I'm with Global Policy Advisors and the Lebanon Renaissance Foundation. Mr. Destro mentioned the Archbishop of Aleppo, Yohanna Brahim. I know Yohanna Brahim. I met him after his visit here to Washington, where he had many meetings in Congress and elsewhere. And I also was by his side at a Track 2 conference where an Iranian ambassador was inviting him to come visit Tehran, promising support and aid. And of course, this is all part of the geopolitical game that's taking place in the region, and the fact that the Iranians and the Russians are much better than the United States in the intricacies of communal politics and are taking advantage of that. But I say that to follow up with a question, which is, are we not better off focusing on issues like supporting representative government, rule of law, pluralism, instead of going into the issues of communal politics, given, and I think Mr. Breger mentioned that, which is how quickly that kind of focus gets politicized, how quickly it becomes of the West supporting Christians or the West supporting Jews, and then that gets into a whole downward spiral politically. So I just wanted your take on that.
Bob, Chris?
Thank you. I think it's a great point, and I think on the surface you're absolutely right. It just messes things up further, and it looks like everything's being politicized. But I think as you go deeper, if you can have sustained dialogues, so spaces where you would meet people you would otherwise not meet, and sometimes conferences are good because they're excuses for coffee breaks. Doesn't matter what the content is. It's good to be in a relationship, and therefore you can speak from within and work through local partners who are trying to do the best thing. And there are a lot of good people in bad places who are trying to bring the very best of their beliefs to bear in public policy and on those kinds of issues. And I think it's just very important to do that. How you do that, as the Congressman says, is very important. And what I have found is it's very critical to be upfront about what you believe and why, but not to be angry about it, and just to share where you're coming from. So for me, there's a difference between interfaith and multi-faith. They're both good words, but interfaith is, let's just talk about the commonalities and ignore the differences. Multi-faith says, well, you know, there's some eternal consequences for how we consider the absolute, but we know that we cannot know the absolute absolutely, so therefore we're going to be humble this side of glory and respect each other as a function of our faith. And then once you get to that point, I think you accelerate practical action faster because you've moved beyond tolerance and into respect. And that's a different game plan than coming outside in and just talking about how can we help you, because that's always received poorly.
Yes, the usual thing that is received well is, what do you suggest we could do together? And that has always been a question. We knew that we had broken through with our Iranian friends when they started making suggestions about what could be done together. And none of them are at that geostrategic level. They're all at levels like human trafficking, drug trafficking, police training, judge training. And those are, you know, those kind of keep you out of that. And that's where the real dialogue takes place. When you're digging a ditch together, you have a real dialogue.
Question from the overflow. It's for you, Congressman. So the proposal for a special envoy for Middle East religious minority has definite merit. But what about efforts to amend and strengthen the International Religious Freedom Act, and also clarify that the ambassador is to be the primary advisor on these issues and should report directly to the Secretary of State?
Well, the ambassador should, and it all depends on the secretary how the ambassador's treated. And I think when Chris's dad was there, the position had more impact because I think the secretary had more impact with it. They just dealt with it. It was there, and so I think personality results in policy. The special envoy is not the solution to the problem. I mean, but it sends a message that we care. And lastly, there is one person in the department who can hold the department accountable, as well as really go outside the department. The bill passed the House 401 to 20. I think to 20. There were no Democrats that voted against the bill in the House. Not one Democrat. There were 20 Republicans that voted against the bill. And so it was just not even partisan. And Anna Eshoo, Anna's not here, but it was nothing. In the Senate, it was Levin and Blunt, but just to send a message. And I would have to say that probably John Danforth deserved the Nobel Peace Prize, because the time and the effort that he put in for the North-South agreement, there would not be a country called Southern Sudan. And to President Bush's credit, he appointed John Danforth, and you may recall at the appointment was in the White House, in the Rose Garden, and on one side was President Bush, and on the other side was Secretary Powell. And so they sent a message to the world that John Danforth is our guy, and we stand with him. And he had the credibility to call the president up, to call Secretary Powell up, and it was not even a full-time job. But it just sends a message out there, and it sends a message within the administration, within the building, and outside. But it would send a tremendous message outside that America cares. But again, personality is policy, and you have to have the right person, but you have to have the President and the Secretary of State accepting this is what they wanted to do. We're going to continue to push it. If you have a special envoy of no credibility, and it doesn't need to be a full-time job. Danforth was not full-time. It is the character. I had recommended that former Senator Feingold be the special envoy for Sudan. Feingold knows President Obama. He supported President Obama. Feingold knows Secretary Kerry. He served with him. He was also chairman of the African Affairs Committee, but they didn't do it. But I think, so you don't need somebody full-time, but what's the message that you send makes the difference.
Thank you. Before I continue with the questions from the floor and the overflow, we have two representatives also here from the region, and I was wondering whether either Ayatollah Iravani or Mr. Hojjatul Islam Sahlani would like to comment, but briefly, on what you heard. We have panelists who are not necessarily who are not from the region except me, which I'm not an expert on these issues. So if you would like to, each of you, if you don't have to, only if you would like to just comment very briefly on the issues that were discussed.
Okay, thanks a lot, and thank you for inviting us here. The freedom of the religion in our region, it can be a drop in the ocean. I mean, in the region, we have a lot of problems, so the freedom of the religion is just a drop in that ocean. Excuse me for this example, somebody asked the camel, why you have a curve on your back? He said, what is straight in my body that I have a curve on my back? Everything is with a curve. So in the Middle East, unfortunately, everything is not in order at all. So this is one part of the problems that we have to look to the whole problems, and to fix it, then this freedom of the religion can be fixed also. One of our problems that in Middle East, especially in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, there are at least four power direct the people. One of them is the law, constitution. The other is the religion. And when the religion conflict with the law, a person doesn't know where to go. Inside the religion, the sect, Sunni, Shia, etc. Beside these two, the religion and the law, we have the common, they call it urf, common. Common opinion of the people. Then we have also the tribe, the power of tribe. So unless we uniform the power which direct the people, then we will have again all these problems will still occur. But practically, the report, what Mr. Wolf mentioned, it is totally correct. And we have to start somewhere to fix this problem. This problem of the freedom of the religion, we never faced it before, at least in my presence in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. I live there. We never face it. We live with the Christian, with the Sunnis, with the Jewish. Even I didn't see Jewish there, but we live with them as a friend, as brother, and we have even a kind of marriage between the sect and between the Christian and the Muslims. But it seemed to me in the last 30 years or 40 years, the problem started. Maybe you know why. I don't know. So start between Sunni and Shia, and between nowadays, with after the winter of the Arab winter, I will not call it spring, call it winter. Also, it's start with the Christian and with the Druze and with many other minority. So solving this, it's need really a long run ideas to apply it, and there is a short run ideas. One of the short that we have to, by the way, I mean the majority of the Muslims, all the Shia, I can say on behalf of the Shia, all the Shia, majority of the Sunnis, they have no problems with the Christian or with the Jewish or with the minority. The very few people who call Salafis, maybe part of that Salafis, paid soldiers to create this problem among the people. Ba'ath Party, they make a big role in Iraq especially. So the real problem is with few people. Now, how to control that few people, how to deal with them, there are many ways. Hopefully, in some other time, we will talk about it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Talha Iravani, briefly,
Yes,
please.
thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Esfandiari. This is Ahmad Iravani. I'm also working with my friends and colleague at Catholic University, teaching courses related to Islam. In very brief, I think the issue of, I would rather to say like non-Muslim minorities, to include Baha'is or others, especially in Iran, since has been mentioned here a few times, I think there are three different levels of problems within Iran. One is the issue of theoretical issue. The other one is the legal issue. And the third one is political issues. There is no time for me to go in details. Otherwise, I had lots of examples and issues. But however, and since Iran is maybe the only Shia countries or Islamic country that there is an intensive integration between politics and also laws and also theoretical aspect, that make the case more difficult. It's not a very secular government. So whatever we have in theoretical foundation, then they might use it in legal issue or they might use it in political issues as well. The leaders, religious leaders are in political position as well. That make the case even worse in terms of dealing with all of these issues and make it more difficult and complicated. However, traditionally speaking, as Imam said, there is no problem between, Jewish communities, Zoroastrian communities, and others. They lived in Iran for hundreds or thousands of years together. When it comes to the political rights, that's the issue of not only maybe Christians, even among the Muslims, the Shias now, they have problem of getting of political rights, let's say in Iranian political system. So that must be dealt in broader sense, rather than just look at it as a Christian or something else. So hoping this new election, for example, I'm very hopeful to give a better kind of opportunities to the Iranian communities, including these minorities, to get involved. The scenario and the problems comes here. The issue of conversion, as it was mentioned, that there are some home churches, there are some missionary communities coming from Christian from outside. Even the Christian communities in Iran, they don't like them. But they are coming through satellites, through their works, and they try to convert Muslims to their own religions, having a very suspicious background of this kind of missionary jobs in the whole Africa and colonial time and others, that make, and adding also that traditional view of conversion is a forbidden according to Muslim view, is make it very sensitive issue, and then make also even the political government wants to do something, make for them very difficult. So that's a big issue. Now, in terms of legal also, we have some legal issues there that limiting. Now, very, very brief, the suggestion which I have, and I agree with wonderful suggestion our friends here, they said, first of all, we have tried to have more kind of exchange among the religious scholars. We as religious leaders and Shia and Muslim leaders need to sit down, because we know Christian leaders, Jewish leaders, they have gone through all of these difficulties in the past. Get their experience, how they are facing these new challenges of modernities. And we started having done for the last 10 years with Iranians, and we have got a lot of good lessons and experience. And in signs of learning from that, here there are lots of new generation of Islamic clergymen within the Islamic seminaries who are now calling for human rights issues. My grand mentor, like Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, Grand Ayatollah Sanis, now are even they saying, conversion is not a big issue as long as it's becoming your personal choice. So these are the hopeful kind of stuff if you are going to support it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's take two questions together, the gentleman and the lady. Yes. Brief questions, please. We are
Thank you.
running out.
Dwight Bashir with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Thank you for the panel. I just wanted to point to two things and pose a question. I think when you're talking about the policy, why is the policy not aggressive enough, and why is it not impacting the region. First of all, the Middle East scholars, the Middle East experts, the people who've come out of government are not at the table here today. Frankly, they're the ones you have to get to. I try to influence folks like this on a daily basis. They still don't give prominence to the issue of religious minorities. Very important for U.S. policy. Secondly, consistency. The U.S. should be speaking out at the highest levels. For instance, Ayatollah Borujerdi, who's an Iranian Shiite a cleric who's been under house arrest for a long time, just as much as they're calling out for Saeed Abedini, another Iranian American who is still in jail, a Christian. In other words, the point is the U.S. has spent a lot of time focusing on particular groups, but we need to have consistency about Shiites in Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So my question is, what is the panel, the folks at the panel, what is the thought in thinking? How do you influence the policy to be consistent, number one, because that's what's going to get traction with those people in the field. When we were in Egypt earlier this year...
I'm sorry, we are running
the last thing I want to say, and I think Congressman Wolf, thank you for your leadership on this, but he probably encountered Christians asking us, why is President Obama supporting the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, these perceptions that are skewed. So in other words, I think it's important to think about these issues. Thank you.
No comments, just questions, please.
My name is Helene von Bismarck. I'm a German historian specialized in the Persian Gulf. Speak up. I have a question for Professor Bröger. I was intrigued by what you said, how over the last 50 years, Christians and Jews in the Middle East have become to be perceived as impositions of the West, how this issue, this religious issue, became a politicized problem. And because I was very intrigued by this panel, and I find it very important that this issue is being addressed in Europe and in the US, because also in Europe it's been
And the gentleman here, last question, and then the panel can take all three questions together.
Hi, my name is Alan Mendelson. I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School, former State Department employee. My question is a relatively simple one. Most of the panel seems to think that it's a very good idea to start from the bottom up. Let's have the ministers talk to the imams and things of that nature. Let's have us all pray together, as Mr. Brager says. My position is that I think it's much better if we start from the top down. What happened to what's going on with the United Nations today? There hasn't been one mention of the United Nations today in this whole conversation. Would it be impossible for the United Nations Security Council to condemn what's going on in Nigeria today? Clearly, that's the most some of the most worst atrocities are going on there. And whether you are Muslim or Christian, you have to agree that those atrocities ought to be condemned. And the same thing is true with what's going on with the Copts in Egypt or elsewhere in the Middle East. Now, why can't the UN be brought together, if necessary, by the United States and the West, so that they will, at the Security Council level, condemn these kinds of things? Thank you very much.
Congressman, you can take whichever part, and final.
Well, the last question is the UN would not comment or get involved because of the Security Council and China on the whole issue of Darfur. And if you recall, about a year ago, there was the article in the paper, the president of China welcomed Bashir, gave him a red carpet agreement welcome to China. So the Security Council has blocked that, and we see that there have been no movement on the issue of Syria. So I think that this UN has not been very effective on this. And it took a long time. I got to Darfur before Kofi Annan got to Darfur. It was a long time, a very, very long time before the UN would say anything about the genocide that took place in Darfur.
Is that because of the OIC?
I'm sorry. Marshall?
I don't think it has anything to do with the OIC. It has to do with the fact that China is purchased all of Sudan's oil. And if you go to the Sudan, you will see thousands of Chinese workers working on various quote-unquote aid projects, living on boats that are kept in the port so that they don't get any contact with the local people. The OIC, as I say, prior to 2011, they had adopted a desire to penalize defamation of religion, which could well mean simply which happened in Africa, a poor British elementary school teacher giving out teddy bears and calling to our elementary school students and calling the bears Mohammed. But now they have at least rhetorically changed and textually changed so that there are now opportunities. And as I said, this Rabat plan and the Istanbul process have actually been trying to promote education and alternate methods to promote religious toleration. So I think that's a positive thing.
This is last comments. 3 quick points. One is just to further emphasize, when we say religious freedom, we mean all faiths and none. Freedom of conscience for all, freedom or belief for all. I want to make that very, very clear. It happens to be concentrated on the Abrahamic traditions and minorities in various contexts. Second, to top down, one thing that I forgot to mention, which is also a recommendation, have the Swiss government come over here and brief our State Department and our Congress on how they have facilitated some of these dialogues. That Salafi dialogue that I referenced, that is at the instigation, as it were, of the Swiss government, as a function of their constitution and how they understand their role in the world. We can learn from how they have brought these things together on an ongoing basis. Also, to further accentuate what Congressman Wolf has said, the testimonies before the House Oversight Committee last week, which I happened to be a part of in terms of the testimonies, everyone was unanimous in that we have to do top-down better structurally and with personnel and with strategy. Read the testimonies, watch it on the internet, but that is clear and consistent. It has nothing to do with party. We're just terrible at this right now. And it's a missing element, as Doug Johnson would say, of our statecraft, and has been since he put out the book in '94. The last piece, in terms of some hope, there's a new document out called Welcoming the Stranger. If you haven't seen it, it's about how humanitarian faith-based NGOs should work together. But basically what it means, there's several different faith traditions that have brief and quick references to their holy scriptures about what it means to serve the stranger, to welcome the stranger in your midst and take care of them, especially in the context of refugees. That kind of bottom-up approach by global organizations that have access to global governments around the world is very important, and it's a good reference as we think about how we might move this conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob?
Just on the comment about the top-down, I mean, I think the top-down is very important. Unfortunately, having had still bearing the scars of dealing with the top-down not being interested, you know, as the late Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And that if we, and that unless we can get the American Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities mobilized, then they're not going to pay attention to us at the top. They aren't now. And so in the meantime, somebody has to have a vision, and it's going to have to come from the bottom.
Marshall, you wanted to add something?
Well, I'll just add one small thing. It's very important that our engagement with Islam not fall into the cul-de-sac of a conflict of civilizations, that we're imposing on them. We're pushing Western values on, quote, the benighted East. And I think all too often some of our rhetoric takes that approach. It's also important to remember a point that Nelson Mandela, who no one can accuse of being a starry-eyed idealist, made, that if you want to make progress, you have to talk with your enemy. And I think that we have too many either self-created barriers or institutional U.S. government barriers of talking to people and groups who we don't like, who have wrong things. But if we don't talk to them, we'll never have a relationship with them. And I think we have to start from that reality. Thank you.
Okay. Congressman, thank you very much for getting in touch with us, giving us your paper, which led to this fantastic panel and this discussion. And we hope we will be continuing this discussion and hope you'll join us again. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you very much. Thanks.